Hello and welcome to Zimbabwe News. The Carter Centre has revealed that their representatives were thrown out of Zimbabwe after they issued a negative observer report on the Zimbabwe 2023 elections. The Carter Centre made this revelation as they issued the final report on the Zimbabwe Election Observation Mission for the Zimbabwe harmonised elections, which were held on 23 to 24 August 2023. I will now read for you the relevant portions of the final report that was issued on Feb 12, 2024. Executive Summary. The Carter Centre's Election Observation Mission found that Zimbabwe's 2023 elections took place in a restricted political environment and that the administration of the elections lacked independence and transparency in key areas. Parliament did not pass several critically important electoral reforms and instead adopted legislation targeting the country's vibrant civil society, effectively silencing reform advocates and political opponents in the months leading up to the vote. Several critical technical aspects of the process were implemented poorly or opaquely, reducing the transparency and credibility of the elections. While voting day was largely peaceful and well implemented by polling staff, Carter Centre observers found delayed openings caused by ballot shortages in several areas, including in some wards considered to be opposition strongholds. Some delays lasted as long as 12 hours, which likely depressed voter turnout. In addition, critical election information, including the final voter's roll and the list of polling stations, was not readily available to stakeholders. Observers also reported numerous instances of assisted voting in rural areas, raising concerns that the secrecy of the vote may have been compromised. Agents from the two main parties were present in most polling stations and tally centres in which the centre observed, and there was a widespread presence of citizen observers. However, Zimbabwean authorities conducted a raid on election night and shut down the non-partisan citizen observation efforts of two respected civil society groups. The centre urges the government of Zimbabwe to drop all pending charges against the civil society activists and respect their right of political participation. The Zimbabwe Electoral Commission (HICSEC) announced the Aug. 23 presidential election results on August 26. The ZEC reported voter turnout at 68.9, a 16.1 drop from the 85 turnout reported in the 2018 general election. Incumbent President Emerson D. Mnangagwa received 2,350,711 votes, 52.6%, and the leading opposition candidate, Nelson Chamisa, received 1967,343 votes, 44. The results for the National Assembly first-past-the-post seats and the local authority were announced at the constituency and ward level, respectively. ZANU-PF won 176 seats in the National Assembly, CCC won 103. In the Senate, ZANU-PF won 33 seats and CCC 27. No other political party secured any. The ZEC published the results on its webpage. However, technical problems made the site difficult to access and led to limited public access to information in the immediate election period. Overall, the 2023 electoral process did not adequately respect Zimbabwe's regional and international commitments for democratic and inclusive elections, and substantially undermined candidates' ability to compete on an equal basis and prevented the genuine expression of the will of the Zimbabwean people. Legal and electoral framework. While Zimbabwe's constitution safeguards fundamental human rights, including the freedoms of opinion and expression, assembly and association, subordinate legislation unduly limits those rights, including in the context of campaigning, and is not fully consistent with international standards. This includes advance notice requirements for public gatherings and demonstrations resulting in de facto authorization, which posed undue limitations on organizers and limitations of freedom of expression under the so-called Patriotic Act. Also, constitutional amendments in 2017 and 2021 increased the President's powers to appoint members of the judiciary and to extend the appointment of senior judges beyond the official retirement age, undermining the independence of the court. Repressive provisions in laws such as the Maintenance of Peace and Order Act (MPO) and the Patriotic Act, as well as the private voluntary organizations (PVO) legislation, need to be revisited to allow for citizens' full participation in public affairs, including respect for the freedoms of assembly, speech, and the press, as established under the Zimbabwean Constitution and in line with the country's regional and international human rights commitments. To ensure a coherent electoral framework, the Electoral Act should be further reviewed and aligned with Zimbabwe's 2013 constitution, regional and international standards adopted by Zimbabwe, and best practices for democracy. A meaningful and comprehensive reform process should take place well in advance of the next election period and as part of an inclusive and transparent consultation process. Election Administration. The legal framework gives wide discretion to the ZEC to regulate and supervise the election process, register voters, delimit constituencies, design, print, and distribute ballot papers, approve the form of and procure ballot boxes, establish and operate polling centres and stations, and accredit citizen and international observers, media, and party agents. The Electoral Act provides that the regulations and statutory instruments issued by the ZEC shall not have effect until they are approved by the Minister of Justice, Legal and Parliamentary Affairs and published in the Gazette, which effectively impedes the full independence of the Commission. The administration of elections lacked transparency in key areas, as the ZEC did not provide critical information, including the printing of ballots and the voter's roll, in a timely manner during various stages of the process, which undermined public and stakeholder confidence in its management of electoral processes. To increase and maintain transparency and enhance its credibility, the ZEC should provide all election-related information of public interest on a regular basis and allow for meaningful observation of its activities. Restrictions and limitations on the work of national and international election observers, including an arduous process for and the late provision or denial of accreditation, severely hindered important independent transparency efforts. Information on the ZEC's decision-making and all other activities should be made available to the public through briefing papers posted on its website, along with regular briefings for candidate representatives and observers in a timely and consideration should be given to developing a proactive communications strategy for the public in general and for political parties in particular. Electoral legislation should enhance the autonomy of the ZEC and acknowledge its constitutional mandate through administrative and regulatory measures without requiring approval from the Ministry of Justice. The Centre also recommends introducing mechanisms to address the lack of public confidence in the impartiality and inclusivity of the ZEC's appointment mechanisms, as well as recruitment of lower-level election commission members. Finally, the accreditation of observers should be the sole responsibility of the ZEC. Constituency boundary delimiter. The boundary delimitation of constituencies in Zimbabwe does not fully ensure the principle of equal suffrage guaranteed by the 2013 Constitution and provided for by international best practice. Instead of allowing a maximum 20 variation as expressed in the Constitution, the ZEC's formula allowed for variations of up to 40 between some constituencies, which does not provide for equality of the vote. Constituency boundary delimitation should be carried out in line with constitutional requirements to uphold the principle of equality of the vote. The constituency delimitation should take place well in advance of the next election period and within a transparent consultation process. Voter education. While the ZEC conducted voter education and publicly invited civil society organisations, private voluntary organisations, and faith-based organisations to apply for ZEC accreditation as voter educators in May 2023, some interlocutors reported that they were only granted approval in August, just days before the election, This prevented effective and timely voter education by a range of qualified organisations. The Centre recommends that CISO accreditation should remain consistent with international and national guidelines and principles. Accreditation should be standardised for voter education as well as for observation of various stages of the electoral process. Positively, ZEC conducted voter education specifically targeting women and youth, especially first-time voters, in line with the Commission's commitment to develop inclusive voter registration materials. Regrettably, voter education in minority languages remained scarce. Some parts of the process were covered extensively, including information about what constitutes various electoral offences, information on the free SMS service to identify one's polling station, and the candidate registration process. However, the ZEC did not provide detailed and sufficient information on voting procedures, including ballot secrecy, the voter's role, or the tallying of results. Commendably, the ZEC's public outreach on Facebook and X relied on visuals and infographics, avoiding any bandwidth challenges posed by videos for users with limited access to the Internet. The Carter Centre encourages the ZEC to conduct greater and more comprehensive voter education over a longer period. Its efforts should focus on all voting procedures, including ballot secrecy, the voter's role, in addition, the ZEC should promote further CATSO engagement in voter education and allow them to use their own materials and methods. Voter registration. Prior to the elections, the ZEC registered 451,811 new voters and transferred 191,738 registered voters to new locations. Although the voter's roll was posted for inspection, public confidence in it remained low because of inaccuracies and errors and limited public information about the Commission's efforts to update the register. There were many reports during the inspection period of voters who found their names through the SEMS system, but not on the physical voter's roll. The ZEC attributed this to new ward boundaries and the addition of polling stations following the boundary delimitation exercise. The ZEC did not promptly provide electoral stakeholders with a copy of the final voter's roll that could be easily reviewed or to increase transparency and contribute to building trust in the accuracy of the voter registration process. The ZEC should publish regular, detailed, disaggregated updates about the voter's roll, which benefits from continuous voter registration. Additional steps should be taken to improve the comprehensiveness and accuracy of the voter registry for future polls. To further increase the transparency of its work, the ZEC should provide copies of the final voter's roll in a user-friendly electronic format and in a timely manner. Candidate registration. The candidate nomination courts sat on June 21, 2023, to process candidates for all levels of the election, including for the party list. The ZEC issued directives on how the party lists should be structured just one day before the courts deliberated, which constrained the ability of some parties to provide adequate numbers of women for provincial council party lists. Parties were allowed to resubmit lists, but this caused delays. In addition to the required set of documents, which included supporting signatures from registered voters, candidates were required to pay significantly high nomination fees. It's $20,000 to run for president and $1,000 to run for the National Assembly. The mechanism to pay nomination fees was complicated and created additional barriers for aspirants. A significant number of aspiring candidates were not approved, many because they had not paid nomination fees. Among other reasons cited, the rejected candidates had the right to appeal to an electoral court. However, because the courts do not have legal deadlines to render a decision and there are no legal time limits to challenge registration, a number of cases were still pending on election day, which effectively prevented some candidates from standing for office. The court's delay in rendering decisions delayed the printing of ballots, which the ZEC cited as the reason for the late delivery of ballots in some areas. Only the ruling party, ZANU-PF, managed to submit party lists and candidates for every constituency and ward election. ZANU-PF ran uncontested in about 10 of wards. The centre recommends that the ZEC consider lowering nomination fees and simplifying payment procedures to allow all citizens an equal opportunity to engage in political processes and stand as candidates. Political environment. Though incidents of political violence were fewer than in the 2018 election cycle, tensions and polarization increased in the months preceding voting, as legislation was introduced or considered that restricted individuals' freedoms of speech, movement, and association, such as the Patriotic Act and the PVFA Amendment Bill. While the PVO legislation was not signed into law and lapsed when Parliament was dissolved, its potential enactment, coupled with the Patriotic Act, produced a stifling effect on Zimbabwean civil society during the electoral period and beyond. Campaign period. The campaign took place in a restrictive and highly polarized environment. Authorities reportedly banned more than 300 public gatherings, making it extremely difficult for parties and candidates to engage with potential supporters and the elect. There were isolated instances of violent intra-party and inter-party clashes. Inter-party violence resulted in the death of a CCC supporter in an attack by suspected ruling party supporters outside of Hara on Aug. 3, 2023. 15 people were arrested and charged with incitement of public violence. The Patriotic Act, adopted in July, further stifled the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and negatively affected the exercise of rights of freedom of association and expression, especially in the context of campaigning. The Electoral Act does not include any measures pertaining to the misuse of state resources during campaigns, contrary to international obligations, and various interlocutors expressed concerns about the ruling party's use of government resources to campaign, blurring the lines between party and state, which, coupled with regulatory requirements that effectively restricted opposition campaign effort, created an uneven playing field among political parties. The Carter Centre recommends the Electoral Act be amended to introduce provisions prohibiting the misuse of state resources and the advantage of incumbency to promote and contribute to a level playing field. Authorities should be sensitive to all instances of abuse of state resources and take timely and effective action to address any violations that occur. In some provinces, traditional leaders violated the constitution through active participation in politics by intimidating their constituents and instructing them to vote for specific parties and candidates, and threatening to punish anyone who defied their orders. The Centre recommends establishing effective enforcement mechanisms, including proportionate sanctions, to discourage traditional leaders and state and local officials from engaging in partisan activities. Campaign finance is not regulated by law in Zimbabwe, which undermines the transparency and accountability of the electoral process. Two political parties, ZANU-PF and MDCT, qualify to receive public funding. Foreign funding is prohibited. The absence of regulations to limit donations from individual donors and the lack of caps on campaign spending, as well as inadequate procedures of reporting and oversight, keep the playing field uneven and enable the misuse of state resources for campaign purposes. Also, the absence of requirements to publish party finance reports undermines the transparency of campaign finance. There are no legal provisions on party finance that encourage gender equality in political parties' identification and selection of most parties and their candidates, as well as independent candidates, reported struggling to raise funds for nomination and campaigning, including parties that accessed public funding. The Carter Centre observed that only the main opposition party, CCC, and the governing ZANU-PF party had enough campaign resources to run their campaigns effectively. The Carter Centre recommends introducing regulations on campaign expenditures, including regular submission of financial reports, the publication of financial reports accessible to the public, and the introduction of graduated sanctions for violations of campaign finance regulations. The Centre further recommends introducing a mechanism to ensure that political parties and candidates comply with any campaign finance regulations put in place, and that trained and competent professionals in an independent institution audit campaign expenses. Information, environment, and social media. Despite reforms to align the legal framework with the Constitution, Zimbabwe's laws still criminalize legitimate speech and provide for harsh prison terms, contrary to the country's international commitments. The lack of accountability mechanisms in the law governing coverage of the election created an unlevel playing field in the media. Traditional and social media were vehicles for spreading misinformation, negative campaigning, derogatory speech, and incendiary content by both major parties and their supporters or shadow accounts. Government-run media targeted political opponents, international observers, and even the electoral process itself, contributing to an environment of insecurity which exacerbated the potential for violence. Gender-based violence online was of particular concern during the electoral process. Social media platforms, especially WhatsApp, provided venues for parties to campaign. ZANU-PF campaign messages appeared more organized, relying in part on officials and state-owned media accounts. The Centre recommends that the legal provisions criminalizing free speech online and offline, such as those in the Criminal Law Codification and Reform Amendment Act 2023 Patriotic Act, and the Cyber and Data Protection Act (PA), should be repealed. The ZEC should ensure the timely public release of media-related information and should consider publishing regular media monitoring results during the process. Also, the ZEC should provide detailed and easily accessible information on its media-related complaint mechanisms. Participation and inclusion. Zimbabwe's constitution and legal framework contain commitments to ensure gender parity. Temporary measures are provided to promote the participation of women. However, these measures are not fully enabled in subordinate legislation, and no sanctions are in place for non-compliance. As a result, women's participation was lower in 2023 than in previous elections, as political parties failed to ensure gender balance among their nominated candidates for directly elected seats, relying on seats reserved exclusively for women to provide for their inclusion. The large increase in candidate nomination fees limited the ability of all but the wealthy from running for National Assembly seats. Zimbabwe's political parties also failed to take steps to promote the participation of youth and people with disabilities as candidates. Existing mechanisms aimed at promoting women's participation should be reviewed to ensure higher representation of women in elective offices, in line with the Constitution and in close consultation with all relevant stakeholders. All changes to the legislation and electoral system should take place well in advance of the next. Consideration could be given to the introduction of legally binding provisions requiring political parties to ensure that they field an equal number of female and male candidates. Selection and nomination of female candidates by political parties, including for proportional should be regulated to ensure equal opportunities for all candidates, as well as compliance with constitutional provisions requiring representation of young women and women with disabilities on party lists. These regulations should be supported by sanctions and financial incentives to ensure their effective compliance. Role of civil society and election observers. Civil society plays a critical role in ensuring support for institutional electoral processes as well as the development of democratic space in a country. Notwithstanding pressure from authorities, Zimbabwe enjoys a vibrant civil society. Several hours after polls closed on Aug. 23, Zimbabwean security forces raided the offices of the Zimbabwe Electoral Support Network, GEZIZERC, and the two accredited and well-known civil society election observation groups, arresting about 40 people and confiscating equipment. The individuals were later charged with attempting to release election results before the official results were announced and were released on bail on Aug. 25. Their court cases are pending. The raid and detentions were an unnecessary, disproportionate, and serious restriction of the fundamental civil and political rights of these organizations and individuals. and prevented their efforts to contribute to the transparency of the election, including independent verification of officially announced results. ZEZN continues to report harassment against its members, civil society leaders, and the diplomatic community. Among other stakeholders, have condemned these actions and called on the government of Zimbabwe to drop all pending charges against the civil society leaders and respect their rights of political participation. The centre emphasises that efforts should be made to protect space for participation in public affairs for all stakeholders and to reassure civil society and other stakeholders that they are free to operate and can do so without repercussion. The Zimbabwean government invited the Carter Centre on July 5 to carry out an election observation mission for the org. 23 elections. However, authorities did not accredit 30 of the centre's short-term observers STOs, who had already arrived in the country. This action represented a severe and unwarranted obstruction of the Carter Centre's mission, inconsistent with commonly recognised and respected norms and practices. It disrupted the centre's methodology, forcing last-minute adjustments to ensure credible observation activities while maintaining its core principles of independence, impartiality, and fact-based reporting. The centre and some other international observer missions experienced challenges accessing representatives of state institutions at the national level, including ZEC officials. Also, false and hostile comments about the centre and other international observer missions were published in local media affiliated with the government, which introduced doubts about the government's commitment to allow observers to carry out a comprehensive, accurate and credible observation in line with their mandate. Election dispute resolution. Despite the mandate given to the ZEC in the Constitution to receive and address complaints, both the Constitution and the Electoral Act lack specific details concerning the types of complaints accepted, the correct procedures for filing complaints, and the guidelines for the ZEC's decision-making process. Additionally, the ZEC had the option to receive complaints through the multi-party liaison committees. MT subsequently refer them to relevant entities such as the police, the Zimbabwe Commission for Human Rights or the Media Commission for Investigation and Feedback. The ZEC demonstrated little interest in dealing with election disputes, and the effectiveness of the MPLs were dependent on the engagement and commitment of parties involved. As a result, the courts became the main avenue for examining election-related complaints. While efforts were made to determine the appropriate jurisdiction based on the type of case filed, petitioners could bypass the designated electoral courts and file election-related matters before the High Court, whose timeline for procedures is not tailored to accommodate the expeditious nature of electoral matters. This challenge was amplified by the large number of nomination challenges filed in front of the High Court for the 2023 harmonised elections. This lack of expedited procedures and clear timeframe resulted in delays of the electoral process and disruption of the electoral calendar, including for the printing and delivery of ballot papers and postal voting. The Centre recommends that the legal framework be revised to clearly delineate the jurisdictions of the High Courts and the Electoral Courts to avoid any overlap or delay. The timeframe for election-related disputes should be shortened to ensure adjudication of cases under expedited procedures, especially if filed on election day or in the days before. The ZEC has the option to receive complaints through the MPLCs. The Centre recommends that the ZEC utilise these bodies as an alternative dispute resolution mechanism. MPC meetings should be held on an agreed-upon schedule and their work based on clear processes to enable the ZEC to resolve disputes expeditiously. Even though the Electoral Act provides for MPLC meetings no sooner than 6 months prior to the elections, consideration could be given to extending or establishing permanent committees to have a continuous forum for intra-party dialogue before and during the electoral process. Election day. Carter Centre observers reported that the voting process ran smoothly at most polling stations. However, in some areas, particularly in Harar, Bulawayo, and Manicaland, polling stations opened late. Although the ZEC extended voting hours and the government officially proclaimed Org. 24 as an additional election day, Various stakeholders expressed concerns that logistical delays may have depressed voter turnout in those areas, some of which are considered opposition strongholds. The Centre strongly recommends that the ZEC complete all pre-election preparations, including delivery of ballots to polling stations, within the legal deadlines to give voters equal access to voting. Carter Centre observers noted that the vast majority of polling stations did not make the voters' roll available for public scrutiny prior to Election Day. While the ZEC made efforts to help voters identify their polling stations with the use of an SMS service, a significant number of voters experienced challenges in identifying their polling stations and were sometimes turned away after spending hours in line. Voters generally had sufficient understanding of ballot procedures. However, Carter Centre observers reported many instances of assisted voting, particularly in some rural areas. Some interlocutors expressed concerns about the overuse of voter assistance, which could have compromised the secrecy of voting. The ZEC held a press conference late on Aug. 26 to announce the results of the presidential election. Results were published on the ZEC's website. Initially, however, technical problems made the site difficult to access and led to limited public access to the information. Voter turnout was reported at 68.9%. To enhance transparency of the process and trust in the results, Centre recommends that ZEC should ensure prompt publication of scanned protocols and election results, disaggregated. Following the election, 2 letters were filed with the Parliament to recall several newly elected MPs, senators, and locally elected councillors representing the CCC on the basis that they were no longer members of the party. The recall campaign was initiated by Sengezo Shabangu, who presented himself as the party's interim Secretary-General. By mid-November, a total of 28 CCCMs, 14 senators, and 69 councillors had been recalled without being consulted or involved in the decision-making process, sparking an interpretive dispute that was unsuccessfully contested in court. Following 2 rounds of recalls and declaration of vacant seats by the Speaker of Parliament, by-elections took place on Nov. 11 and 9, 2023 and was scheduled to be held again on Feb. 3, 2024 to fill vacancies in the National Assembly and in local government. Though the CCC announced it would not participate in the by-elections, the recalled MPs applied to stand as CCC candidates, and the High Court barred them from recontesting. As a result of the duly elected individuals being deprived of political representation and of participation in by-elections, as well as low turnout, the ruling party has secured a parliamentary majority. The by-elections had a significantly lower voter turnout compared with the August general elections and, considering the number of eligible voters in the respective areas, indicate erosion of the trust and confidence in the election process, political disillusionment, and voter apathy. In a democracy, the power to recall a representative from public office is an important mechanism to ensure that elected officials remain accountable to their constituents. Once elected to office, representatives must therefore be accountable to citizens as well as to their political parties. The Centre recommends that Sections 129 and 278 of the Zimbabwe Constitution, which outline various circumstances for the termination of an MP, senator, or local authority councillor, should be revised to include more safeguards to ensure they are not open to abuse or manipulation by political parties and leaders seeking to settle political scores. The Carter Centre in Zimbabwe. Former US President Jimmy Carter and the Carter Centre have had a long-standing interest in the development of democracy in Zimbabwe. While in office in 1980, President Carter recognized the newly independent state of Zimbabwe and advocated for the development of robust and durable democratic institutions in the formation of the new government. The Carter Centre began working in Zimbabwe in 1989 with the Project Africa initiative designed to improve food security by increasing food production in rural villages. The initial success of this program contributed to Zimbabwe's role as a breadbasket for the region prior to the onset of the country's economic crisis and hyperinflation. Over time, as the country's democratic institutions and economic prospects came under increasing pressure. The centre explored several potential governance projects. In 2002, the Carter Centre expressed interest in observing the general election, and a team travelled to Harare to meet key stakeholders to discuss preparations for the polls and the prospects for a credible democratic election. Ultimately, the Zimbabwean government decided against extending an invitation to the centre to observe the polls. The centre issued a short statement indicating that the pre-election period fell short of international standards and was seriously flawed. In 2013, the Carter Centre carried out a pre-election visit to Zimbabwe in advance of voting to assess whether its engagement in the process would be welcomed by stakeholders. During the visit, several interlocutors, including representatives of the three major political parties, indicated they would welcome a Carter Centre observation presence. However, the ZEEC's accreditation committee later declined the centre's application, and there was no observer mission. In 2018, the centre was invited to observe Zimbabwe's harmonised presidential and parliamentary elections and deployed an expert mission to assess key aspects of the electoral process. The centre conducted a pre-election assessment in March 2018 and established a presence in May 2018. The team analysed Zimbabwe's legal and electoral framework, election administration, political and electoral environment, campaign period, women's participation, civil society engagement, and electoral dispute resolution. It did not conduct election day observation in a systematic and comprehensive manner. The centre issued a statement expressing concerns about post-election tensions and the violent clashes that occurred between armed security forces and protesters in Harare, which resulted in multiple casualties and one death. It called on Zimbabwe's political leaders to set an example by refraining from inflammatory rhetoric, which could incite further violence, and on security forces to protect citizens and avoid disproportionate use of force. Together with the African Union Election Observation Mission, HOAM, the Commonwealth Election Observation Mission, the SADC Election Observation Mission, the SADC Parliamentary Forum Election Observation Mission, ACFEDC Mission, CUMSA Election Observation Mission, the European Union Election Observation Mission, and the Joint International Observation Mission deployed by the International Republican Institute and the National Democratic Institute, the centre issued a joint statement condemning post-election violence. In addition, Carter Centre experts provided technical assistance to the Zimbabwe Election Support Network, ZEZN, a leading citizen observer organisation, to support its data collection efforts for long-term observers, and with 2 Zimbabwean CISOs on fact-checking. The expert mission remained in Zimbabwe through Aug. 12, 2018, and issued a final report on its findings. Historical and political background. Since its independence in 1980, Zimbabwe has been governed as a multi-party constitutional democracy with a strong presidential system. This structure was introduced in 1987 when the government amended the constitution to introduce the executive presidency. One Zimbabwe's government is composed of the executive presidency, parliament, and local authorities. The country has been governed exclusively by ZANU-PF for the past 43 years, except for a brief interlude in 2009-2013 when ZANU-PF co-governed the country with the Opposition Movement for Democratic (MDC) in a national unity government that aimed to resolve the political conflict and polarization caused by a dispute over the 2008 presidential election results. Although several parties have contested elections since 1980, ZANU-PF's dominance of electoral politics was shaken only in the 2000 parliamentary elections, when the MDC party, newly formed in 1999 and led by Morgan Tsvangirai, a former trade union leader, won 57 of 120 elected seats against ZANU-PF's 62 seats. Since the MDC's formation, the dominant political parties in Zimbabwe's elections have been ZANU-PF, led by Robert Mugabe, who was the party's leader from 1975 and the country's first post-independence president until his removal from the leadership of both ZANU and Zimbabwe in a November 2017 military coup, and the MDC, which was led by its founding leader, Morgan Tsvangirai, until his death in February 2018. Although Nelson Chamisa was poised to assume the MDC's party leadership, the court declared his takeover unconstitutional and therefore null and void. In January 2022, Chamisa formed the Citizens' Coalition for Change. Since 2000, Zimbabwe's elections have been disputed. There have been allegations of widespread electoral manipulation, including vote buying, gerrymandering of parliamentary and ward constituencies, and ballot stuffing to predetermine election results. Disputes have centred on the general lack of transparency in electoral processes, including in the voters' roll, vote counting, and transmission of results. There also have been widespread complaints by both opposition parties and election observers about restrictions on the ability of opposition parties to campaign and access public media, particularly national radio and television, both of which have a wide national reach. More critically, Zimbabwe's elections since the country's independence in 1980 have been characterized by the overwhelming use of violence and intimidation of voters and candidates, particularly by leaders and supporters of the ruling party and government security forces, including members of the army, police, and the intelligence units. The 2002 and 2008 elections, in particular, were conducted amid widespread political violence that resulted in the deaths and maiming of many Zimbabweans before, during, and after the elections. 7 Human Rights Watch reported that 200-300 people, mainly opposition party supporters, were killed during the 2008 electoral cycle. More than 50 people were beaten and tortured, and about 36,000 were displaced. In 2002, 33 people were reportedly killed, and many opposition activists and polling agents were threatened, abducted, arrested, and following widespread condemnation of the use of politically motivated violence by members of the government, security services, and the governing ZANU-PF party during the 2008 elections, electoral violence decreased until the country's last general election held on July 31, 2018. As with previous elections held in the post-2000 period, the 2018 election results were disputed on suspicion of cheating in vote, counting and in the transmission of ballots from ward polling centres to the provinces and the ZEC vote tallying. The incumbent, President Mnangagwa, was declared the winner with 51.4% of the vote, while the opposition MDC Alliance's Nelson Chamisa came in second with 45% of the vote. ZANU-PF won 179 of the elected seats, while the MDC Alliance won 88. The peaceful conditions that prevailed were disrupted, however, on Aug. 1, 2018, when government soldiers shot at opposition party supporters protesting a delay in the announcement of presidential election results, killing 6 and maiming 35 civilians. While election violence declined in the past 2 general elections, political intimidation subsisted. There has been a shift toward the use of more covert and subtle forms of political violence, intimidation, and voter manipulation. These nuanced forms of intimidation, previously highlighted by local observer groups, include exclusion or threats to exclude opposition party supporters from government social services, jobs, and business opportunities. 10 Electoral violence and intimidation in Zimbabwe over the past few years also has moved into the cyber realm. Candidates and voters reported increasing cases of cyberbullying in the 2018 election. Women and girls have been most affected by electoral cyberbullying. Zimbabwe has experienced historic challenges in organizing free, fair, and credible elections that meet international and regional standards. Nonetheless, there has been some progress over the years in addressing certain challenges through constitutional and electoral law reform. The most significant reforms made in the past few years include the passing of the 2013 Zimbabwe Constitution, which has several provisions designed to guarantee important political freedoms and civil rights. The Constitution also has several provisions that provide legal clarity on electoral practices and processes in Zimbabwe, including clarifications regarding the formation of the ZEC and appointment of its commissioners, the ZEC's roles and responsibilities, the delimitation of electoral boundaries, and the timeframe for electoral processes. Amendments to the Electoral Act in 2008, 2012, and 2018, including the inclusion of the Electoral Code of Conduct into the Act in 2018, all helped to provide further legal clarity on key aspects of the electoral processes, including voter registration, the preparation, compilation, and maintenance of the voter's roll, voter eligibility, and candidate nomination for Parliament, the Presidency, and local authorities. Some amendments made over the years, particularly the guidelines for voting and counting procedures, have helped to address historical electoral challenges in Zimbabwe. In 2017, the ZEC also introduced a biometric voter registry (BEV). The previous registry was difficult to audit and contained duplicate and deceased voters. The BVR system stores voters' physical and biological characteristics to identify them easily at polling stations. Though Zimbabwe has introduced some progressive electoral management laws and policies over the past decade, the government's continued lack of political will to put them into action remains a challenge. Election observation phases. The Carter Centre uses an election cycle model to frame the processes that define the pre-election, election, and post-election periods. Throughout the election cycle, the Centre observes and analyses the political, electoral, and security environment, as well as the operational activities of an election. The inclusion of social media monitoring has evolved in response to its wide adoption by stakeholders, parties, candidates, media, and election officials. Pre-election. The Carter Centre started its outreach to stakeholders and preparations for the Zimbabwe mission in 2022, and following the announcement of the election on May 30, applied for accreditation by the ZEC in early June 2023. The Centre's request for permission to deploy the core team in advance of the electoral campaign in June was denied. Due to the lack of confirmation of visas, the team's deployment was postponed for nearly a month, and core team experts worked remotely from abroad. Members arrived in Harare on July 29 and were accredited on August 3, 2023. In the pre-election period, the core team focused their analysis on the legal framework, planning and implementation of the election law, election staff training, voter education, candidate nomination, complaints and appeals, and the electoral campaign period. Preparations for ELTO deployment commenced in July and continued after the core team's arrival in Zimbabwe. This included the preparation of an observer deployment plan and a pre-deployment briefing with materials. Initially, in accordance with election observation methodology, the Centre planned to deploy 16 NASOs in pairs across Zimbabwe. The deployment plan took its final shape in Harare after the arrival of most ELTOs in early August. One observer was not allowed into the country by the border police and returned home. The deployment plan was adjusted to include 7 observation teams. After the observers were accredited and briefed, they were deployed in provincial capital cities. 5 teams were responsible for 1 province apiece. 2 teams were responsible for Zimbabwe's largest metropolitan areas and a neighbouring province, Harare and Mashonaland Central, and Bulawayo and Matabeleland North. Election Day. To reinforce the election observation mission's capacity, 47 short-term observers arrived in Harare on Aug. 1718. Regrettably, the ZEC denied accreditations to 27 Carter Centre delegates who were slated to observe on Election Day. Following this decision, the Centre adjusted its observation plan, deploying fewer observer teams, while maintaining a presence in each province. The Centre deployed staff as short-term observers and had some delegates assume staff responsibilities in support of the mission deployment. Despite delays and denial of accreditation for several observers, The centre conducted a pre-deployment briefing in Harar on Aug. 1920. The observer delegation received an overview of the political background, campaign, electoral framework and preparations, mission logistics, and security protocols to guide their participation in the overall mission. The observers also were trained on the Carter Centre's data collection methodology and ELMO, the tool used to fill out and submit observer checklists via mobile phones on election day. In addition, TOS provided regional briefings to the STOS on their areas of deployment. 2 days before election day, long and short-term observers were deployed in teams of 2 to all 10 provinces of Zimbabwe. The deployment period allowed the STO teams to familiarize themselves with their deployment areas and prepare for election day observation by meeting local election commissions, security officials, polling station staff, observers, and other. After the delayed deployment of the core team, the L2 arrival was scheduled for Aug. 1 and 2. The delay was caused by a delay in the confirmation of entry visas for the observers by the government of Zimbabwe. 5. The observer briefing focused on the observation methodology, Zimbabwe's election operations and legal framework, as well as the Carter Centre and the ZEX codes of conduct for observers. Stakeholders to gain a better understanding of the local election environment. Observers also were able to plan a route for the observation day from among a list of randomly selected polling stations and observe compliance with the campaign silence period, when no active campaigning by the candidates or publishing news or opinion articles that favour any of the candidates is allowed. On election day, 53 observers visited 234 polling stations to observe election procedures, including balloting, counting, and tabulation processes. Observer teams assessed the process in 19 tallying centres at ward and constituency levels. Autos continue to observe the tabulation process in provincial tally centres through Aug. 24-28. In total, the Carter Centre followed the tabulation in all 10 provinces in Zimbabwe. On Aug. 25. Post-election, the Carter Centre International Election Observation Mission publicly released its preliminary statement of findings and conclusions on the election process on August 25. After Election Day, the mission continued to observe tabulation, announcement of results, and the post-election environment. Has remained in their assigned areas and continued to follow developments, including activities of ZEC provincial commissions, political parties and candidates, SUSOs, and media. Although the initial schedule provided for the continued deployment of LILTOs to observe the post-election environment for a few weeks, the observer's stay in Zimbabwe was cut short when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs refused to extend visas. The teams returned to Harar on Aug. 29 debriefed on Aug. 30 and observers departed Zimbabwe on Aug. 30. The core team left Zimbabwe on Sept. 4, 2023, before the entire election process has been completed. Nevertheless, the Carter Centre Observer Mission continued to follow the final stages of the election processes, such as election dispute resolution, as well as the recalls of elected CCC parliamentarians and councillors and the subsequent conduct of by-elections in November and December. On 9, 2027-2023, the Carter Centre's Observer Mission conducted a follow-up visit to present its key findings and conclusions to government representatives, Parliament, independent constitutional bodies, political parties, civil society, and other relevant stakeholders, and to discuss any reactions they had to the preliminary statement, as well as accompanying recommendations to the authorities and other stakeholders on how the election process could be improved and possible future follow-up activities or assistance with election authorities and other relevant officials. The Centre continued to experience challenges accessing representatives of the relevant state institutions, including ZEC officials,